From the outside, their lives looked perfect. Long corridors of polished stone, candlelight flickering across silver cutlery, the soft rustle of silk on a staircase, and voices always measured, always careful, drifting through rooms that smelled of roses and old wood. But behind the walls of the manor, the wives lived in quiet desperation, trapped in a gilded cage of their own making. If you had stood at the gate of one of those great English country houses in the early 1900s and looked in through the iron railings, you might have thought, what a life! What grace! What order! What elegance! But that wasn't the full story. Because behind every perfectly arranged flower arrangement, behind every smile exchanged at dinner, behind every composed, unhurried appearance in the morning room, there was a woman holding something in. Something she couldn't say. Something she couldn't show. Something she had learned, slowly and carefully, to carry without letting anyone see the weight of it. And tonight, we are going to step quietly into that world, into the private corners, into the unspoken rules, into the lives behind the performance. But before we go any further, I want to take just a moment to welcome you. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is where you are, I'm glad you're here. If you feel like it, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is there. There is something quietly lovely about knowing that people are settling into this from so many different places in the middle of the night, or the early hours of a quiet morning, or a long, slow evening where rest is finally possible. So tell me where you are. I read everyone. And now, wherever you are, let yourself settle. You don't need to be anywhere else tonight. You don't need to hold anything. You can simply be here. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. And let this world carry you gently for a little while. Downton Abbey, for those who haven't spent time there, is more than a television drama. It is a portrait of a world in transition. Set across several decades in the early 20th century, it follows the Crawley family, an aristocratic household presiding over a vast Yorkshire estate, as the old world of Edwardian England slowly, reluctantly, gives way to something new. There are earls and countesses. There are butlers and ladies' maids. There are debutante balls and shooting parties and the particular suffocating pressure of appearing exactly as you are expected to appear at every hour of the day. And at the center of all of it, the women, not just as decoration, not just as background, but as the very architecture of that world. The women of Downton Abbey, whether they were born into that life or married into it, were the ones who held everything together. They managed the social calendar. They navigated the family politics. They maintained the image. They absorbed the tension. They smiled through the grief and the loneliness and the disappointment. And then they dressed for dinner. And yet, for all the power they quietly held, they were surrounded on every side by rules. Rules about what to say. Rules about what not to say. Rules about how to walk into a room, how to leave one, how to behave in company, how to address a servant, how to respond to a husband, how to receive a guest, how to absorb bad news, all without letting the mask slip even slightly. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about these rules is this. Most of them were never written down anywhere. They were simply known. And the women who didn't know them, or worse, the women who broke them, found out very quickly what the consequences were. Before we go further, I want you to imagine something. Imagine waking up in a room that is not quite yours. Oh, it has your name on the door. Your things are arranged on the dressing table. Your maid comes to help you dress each morning, and she knows your preferences, and she is quiet and efficient and loyal. But the room was chosen for you. The schedule waiting downstairs was arranged for you. The guest list for the weekend was curated by someone else, or by the customs of a world that predates you by centuries. And you are expected always to be present, gracious, composed to be, in a word, appropriate. Even on the days when you are tired, even on the days when something is wrong, and you cannot name it. Even on the days when the weight of expectation settles so heavily on your shoulders that you feel, for a moment, that you might disappear beneath it. That was the world these women lived in, a world of extraordinary beauty, and extraordinary constraint. And as this evening settles quietly around you, I want to take you into that world slowly, not as a historian, not with dates and footnotes, but as a quiet observer, standing in the corner of a drawing room, watching, listening, noticing the things that were never meant to be noticed. Because the hidden lives of these women are not a footnote to history. They are history, and it is time we paid attention. Let us begin at the beginning. Marriage in the world of Downton Abbey was not primarily a romantic arrangement. Oh, romance existed. Love existed, sometimes fiercely, sometimes tenderly, sometimes in quiet corners where no one could observe it. But that was not the function of marriage in the aristocratic and upper middle class world of early 20th century England. The function of marriage was alliance. A great house like Downton Abbey was not just a home. It was an institution. It required maintenance, financial, social, political, and a wife was, among many things, a means of maintaining it. When a young woman married into a family like the Crawleys, she was not simply becoming a wife. She was becoming a role. She was becoming the countess, the lady of the house, the woman whose behavior reflected directly on the family name that was now hers, and whose failures, if they came, would be felt not just by her, but by everyone connected to the estate. This was understood before the wedding. It was implicit in every interaction during the courtship, and it was never more clearly communicated than in the moment she stepped through the front doors as a married woman for the first time. The role was always bigger than the person who played it, and the woman, the individual, with her own thoughts and desires and fears, was expected to fit herself into that role as neatly and invisibly as possible. To understand what this meant in practice, consider the way that the mistress of a great house spent her days. From the moment she rose, and the time she rose was itself regulated, part of the household rhythm, she was operating in a public capacity. Even breakfast, which might seem like a private meal, was a performance of sorts. The way she entered the room, the way she greeted her husband, the way she interacted with any family members present, these were not simply personal moments. They were observed by servants, by children, by guests, and they communicated something. They communicated the tone of the household. A wife who appeared frazzled at breakfast sent a signal. A wife who seemed disconnected, or cold, or unhappy, also sent a signal. And in a world where reputation was everything, Signals mattered enormously. The afternoon brought its own pressures. Calling hours, the ritual of receiving visitors or visiting others, was a formal social obligation that carried its own complex web of protocols. Who called on whom first? How long a call should last? What topics were appropriate? What should never be mentioned? A mistake in any of these interactions could ripple outward in ways that were difficult to predict and very difficult to correct. Lady Cora, the American-born Countess of Grantham in Downton Abbey, navigates this with a kind of composed intelligence that is remarkable to watch. She came from outside the system, her family's money was what saved Downton from financial ruin, and yet she absorbed the expectations of her role with a grace that suggested complete belonging. But watch her closely, and you see the work. The constant, invisible work of being what everyone needs her to be. And here is the thing about that work. It was never finished. There was no moment in a wife's day when she could simply stop performing the role and be nothing but herself. The role had no off hours. There is a moment in Downton Abbey, quiet, almost unremarkable, that has stayed with me. One of the women of the house is sitting alone in a room that everyone else has left. The house is still around her. And for just a moment, her expression shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would necessarily call grief, but shifts into something unguarded. A kind of blankness, a tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep, and then someone enters the room, and the expression is gone. She is herself again, composed, engaged, present, as if that unguarded moment never happened. That moment, I think, is a glimpse of something real, because the women of that world did not simply play a role. Over time, they became the role. Or at least, they became so practiced at it that the line between who they were and who they were expected to be became almost impossible to locate. Consider how early it started. A girl born into the aristocracy was not simply raised, she was trained. From childhood, she learned how to sit, how to speak, how to walk into a room. She learned what kinds of ambitions were appropriate and what kinds were not. She learned that her future, her entire future, was likely to be determined not by anything she did or thought or discovered about herself, but by who she married. And then she married. And in the act of marriage, she often lost even her name. Lady Mary Crawley became Lady Gillingham or whoever. Lady Edith's identity was long entangled with whether she could successfully marry at all. The woman became the wife, and the wife became the house. And the house had its own needs that took permanent precedence. But the role they played came with rules that most people never saw. And those rules reached into every corner of their lives, including the most intimate ones. What made this particularly complex and particularly difficult to navigate was that the expectations placed on these women were often contradictory. She was expected to be warm but not emotional, engaged but not domineering, beautiful but not vain, intelligent but not assertive, present but not overwhelming, soft enough to be approachable, composed enough to command respect. The ideal aristocratic wife of the early 20th century was, in other words, an almost impossible person to actually be. And yet, they tried. Most of them, for most of their lives, tried. Lady Violet, the Dowager Countess, perhaps the most formidable woman in Downton Abbey's world, spent decades mastering these contradictions. She wielded wit like a weapon, used charm as a form of control, and maintained an iron composure that very rarely cracked. But even Violet, has moments where you catch a glimpse of what it cost her. The loss of her husband. The years of raising children in a system that required her to love them at a distance. The slow disappearance of the world she was trained for. She never complained. She never wilted. She was, to the very last, exactly what the role required. And in watching her, in admiring her, it is easy to miss the sadness underneath. Easy to miss the woman who was always there, beneath the Countess watching, enduring, performing. Because the rules of speaking, the ones that governed everything from dinner conversation to private disagreement, were not simply about politeness. They were about survival. Speech, in the world of Downton Abbey, was a highly managed activity. This is not immediately obvious, because the characters talk constantly. The drawing rooms are full of conversation. The dinner tables buzz with commentary and wit and, occasionally, the kind of glittering put-down that only the Dowager Countess could deliver with quite such devastating precision. But look more closely. Look at what is said and what is not said. Look at the pauses, the careful half-second before a response, where something is being considered and then set aside. Look at the subjects that are gently, expertly steered around. Look at who speaks first, who defers, who redirects. Conversation among the upper classes of early 20th century England was a performance art, and the women who were best at it were the ones who could say exactly what they meant while appearing to say something else entirely. Lady Violet is the supreme example. Her conversations are architectural, carefully constructed, elegantly finished, with hidden rooms that only reveal themselves later. She never says anything accidentally. She never reveals more than she intends. But this kind of mastery took decades to develop. And in the meantime, for a young wife learning the ropes, the rules of speech were a minefield. Because saying the wrong thing, even with the best intentions, could cause damage that lasted years. And the wrong thing was often simply the truth. Perhaps the most consistent rule governing a wife's speech was this: you did not publicly disagree with your husband. Not in front of guests. Not in front of servants. Not in the dining room, or the drawing room, or anywhere that could be observed. Disagreement happened. It always happened. In any marriage, but it was handled in private, in the bedroom or the sitting room, in conversations that were carefully managed and quickly resolved. To contradict your husband publicly was to undermine him, and to undermine him was to undermine the household. And to undermine the household was, in this world, a kind of violence. Slow, social, irreparable. Lord and Lady Grantham, Robert and Cora, navigate this throughout the series with varying degrees of success. Cora, on several occasions, clearly disagrees with her husband's decisions about the estate, about the children, about how to handle a crisis. But her disagreement almost always finds expression in private, in a quietly firm conversation in their rooms, where the door is closed and the servants are not listening. In public, she presents a unified front. And when she doesn't, when the disagreement breaks the surface in front of others, it is notable precisely because it is rare. and the tension it creates is immediate and palpable. Because everyone in that room knows that something has shifted, that a rule has been broken, and that the breaking of it will need to be addressed. And sometimes, the silence wasn't optional. There were subjects that simply did not exist in the vocabulary of a well-bred wife, things that could not be acknowledged, let alone discussed. Beyond disagreement, beyond the political maneuvering of household and social conversation, there was a deeper silence. The silence around emotion. In the world of Downton Abbey, feeling things was not, in itself, a problem. These were not people without emotional depth. On the contrary, many of them felt things with extraordinary intensity. But showing it was another matter entirely. Grief was permitted, but briefly, and in private. Anger was not permitted at all, at least not in any form that could be clearly identified as anger. Fear had to be translated into action or into composure before it could be visible. Love, genuine, complicated, inconvenient love, had to find its way through the narrow channels that propriety allowed. Lady Mary is perhaps the most striking example of this. Her emotional life is vast and turbulent. Anyone who watches the series for more than an episode can see that. She loves deeply, grieves deeply, struggles deeply. But her face, her magnificent, controlled face, rarely reveals the full extent of it. She has learned to present herself as cool, even cold, to allow others to underestimate what she is feeling because that is safer. Because in her world, emotion that could not be controlled was emotion that could be exploited. And so she controls it. And in controlling it, she presents to the world, and perhaps to herself, a version of herself that is less than the whole truth. But here is something that is rarely said out loud about the women of Downton Abbey. The ones who seemed the coldest were often the ones who felt the most. The performance of composure was sometimes the only way to survive the feeling. Over time, most of these women learned something very specific. They learned the difference between what they thought and what they said. Not as a form of dishonesty, though it could shade into that, when circumstances demanded, but as a form of self-preservation. You learned not to express an opinion too forcefully, because forcefulness was unfeminine. You learned not to ask too many questions, because curiosity about the wrong things was inappropriate. You learned not to speak of money in social situations, even though money, the having or not having of it, controlled almost everything. You learned not to mention illness in certain company, not to acknowledge certain social realities, not to name certain feelings. And gradually, over years of practice, the things you didn't say became as much a part of you as the things you did. Lady Edith, in the earlier seasons of Downton, has not yet fully learned this discipline. She says things she shouldn't, makes appeals that expose her longing, reveals frustrations that should have stayed private, and she pays for it again and again in the subtle currency of judgment. But by the later seasons, she has learned. She has become, in her own way, as composed as any of them. And watching that learning happen, watching a woman shape herself to fit a world that was not built for her, is quietly, persistently heartbreaking. And even their free time, as we will see, was not truly free, because the schedule waiting for them from morning to night was not something they had chosen. Let us talk about time, specifically who owned it. In the great houses of early 20th century England, time was organized with a precision that could feel, from the outside, almost military. Meals at exact hours, social obligations at appointed times. The day divided into blocks, each with its own purpose and protocol. And the mistress of the house was expected to be present, appropriately present, for each of them. Mornings began with consultation. The mistress would meet with the housekeeper, Mrs. Hughes, in Downton Abbey's world, to go over the day's arrangements, menus, guest requirements, household logistics. This was real work, substantive, practical, requiring both knowledge and judgment. But it was work performed within a framework she had not designed and could not fundamentally alter. The afternoon brought calling hours, that elaborate ritual of social visit-making that was as much obligation as leisure. A wife could not simply decide not to call on someone who expected a call. She could not choose to spend that afternoon reading or walking or doing something she had chosen for herself. The call was not optional. It was a form of social currency, and the currency had to be maintained. Even the hours that appeared to belong to the women of the house, the quiet afternoon pause, the evening before dinner, were not truly unobserved, because in a great house, someone is always watching. Weekend house parties, a fixture of the aristocratic calendar, represent one of the clearest examples of how completely a wife's time was consumed by the social role she was expected to play. These were not casual gatherings. They were carefully choreographed events that could last several days, involving dozens of guests, complex sleeping arrangements, intricate seating plans, organized activities from morning to night. And the mistress of the house, Lady Grantham, in Downton's world, was responsible for the entire thing. Not responsible in the modern sense where you might make a list and delegate tasks. Responsible in the sense that everything that happened reflected on her. If a guest was uncomfortable, it was her failure. If the food was wrong, her failure. If the wrong people were seated near each other and an awkward conversation resulted, her failure. Success was invisible, because success meant everything going exactly as it should, and that was simply expected. Only failure was visible. Lady Cora manages these occasions with what appears to be effortless grace, and that appearance of effortlessness is itself a significant achievement, because behind it is constant, invisible labor. The reading of social situations, the management of egos, the quiet navigation of a weekend where a dozen different personalities need to be kept comfortable, entertained, and diplomatically managed. And when it's over, when the last guest has left and the house is quiet again, there is barely a pause before the next obligation begins. The women of Downton had a word for the season when the social calendar was at its most demanding, simply the season. And those who lived through it understood that it was not a celebration. It was a marathon. And yet, there were moments that appeared from the outside to be leisure. Afternoon walks, morning correspondence, hours in the library or the garden, time spent with needlework or drawing or music. These were the sanctioned leisure activities of a well-bred woman, and they were all, in their way, constrained. Walks were taken in appropriate company or with appropriate supervision. Correspondence was a social obligation as much as a personal one. Letters required careful composition, social awareness, the same management of impression that governed in-person interaction. Even music, which might seem like the purest form of personal expression, was governed by expectations. A woman was expected to play competently. She was not expected to play with passion or ambition or in ways that drew too much attention to herself. Reading was more private, and therefore more genuinely one's own. But even reading was subject to surveillance. What you read said something about you. A novel was acceptable. Certain philosophical or political texts were perhaps not. Lady Sybil, the youngest of the Crawley daughters, and in many ways the most revolutionary, understood this better than almost anyone. Her desire to do something, to be a nurse, to become politically engaged, to marry outside her class, was not simply unusual. In the world she came from, it was almost unthinkable. And watching her navigate that world, watching her try to carve out a life that belonged to her while respecting the people she loved, is one of Downton's most quietly devastating narratives. Because love, marriage, wasn't always what it seemed from the outside. And behind the formal arrangement of husband and wife, there were emotional realities that the world around them was never meant to see. It would be easy and unfair to suggest that these women had no agency at all. They did. It was limited, and it was often indirect, and it operated through channels that required significant skill to navigate. But it existed. The Dowager Countess is perhaps the most vivid example of female agency in Downton Abbey. She makes things happen. She shapes outcomes. She deploys her intelligence and her social capital with extraordinary precision. But the methods available to her, the only methods available to her, are all indirect. Suggestion, influence, the carefully worded letter, the well-timed visit, the favor asked, and the favor owed. Direct power, the kind that could simply decide and act, was not available to her, or to any of them. And that gap between the influence they exercised and the power they were denied tells us everything we need to know about the world they lived in. They were not helpless, but they were constrained. They were not voiceless, but they were silenced in the ways that mattered most. And they were not loveless, but love, as we are about to explore, was a far more complicated thing than it appeared. Because marriage in this world was not always an arrangement of the heart, and love wasn't always part of the negotiation. There is a scene in Downton Abbey that many viewers remember. Lord and Lady Grantham, Robert and Cora, are in their bedroom. It is late, the house is quiet, and they are speaking to each other, not about the estate, not about the children, not about any of the external pressures that fill their days. They are speaking about each other, about the distance between them, about something that has gone wrong, and whether it can be repaired. And what strikes me about that scene, what makes it linger, is how unusual it is. Because for most of the series, Robert and Cora are the picture of a good marriage. Respectful, affectionate in the restrained way of their class, unified in front of the world. But the moments where they are truly vulnerably present with each other are rare, and when they come, they are visible against the formality that surrounds them precisely because of their contrast. This was not unusual. This was typical. Marriage in the aristocratic world of early 20th century England was, first and foremost, a social institution. Love was possible within it. It happened, but it was not the thing that marriage was designed to produce. Marriage produced heirs. Marriage produced alliances. Marriage produced the continuation of a family name and the consolidation of wealth and land. What it produced emotionally was more complicated. The formality between husband and wife in this world is something that requires a moment to fully absorb. They addressed each other with titles. In certain contexts, they maintained separate bedrooms, a practice that was standard, not unusual, and that said something significant about the architecture of intimacy in their world. Their relationship played out largely in public spaces, the dining room, the drawing room, where the rules of social interaction applied as much between them as they did with guests. Private life, genuine, unobserved private life, was rare, and when it existed, it was brief, and it took place in the narrow hours between the end of the social day and the beginning of sleep. This is not to say that deep feeling was absent. On the contrary, the restraint with which these feelings were managed tells you something about their intensity. Lord Grantham's restrained tenderness with Cora, the way he sometimes watches her when she's not aware of it, suggests a genuine and lasting attachment. But the channels through which that attachment can be expressed are narrow and governed by the same rules that govern every other aspect of their lives. And for the women, those channels were even narrower. A wife who expressed too much affection publicly was thought undignified. A wife who expressed too much need privately was thought demanding. A wife who expressed grief at the death of a husband was permitted for a defined period and then expected to recover and continue. And duty in this world was not just something you did. It was something you were. And for many women, the line between duty and identity had long since blurred beyond recognition. When Cora loses a child early in the series, through circumstances too painful to detail, her grief is real. It is immense, and it is managed. It is managed by the house, by the servants, by the routine that continues regardless, by the necessity of appearing at meals, receiving visitors, maintaining the image of a household that is functioning. There is no space for grief to be simply grief. It must be organized, contained, and eventually set aside, because the world around her does not pause for it. And Robert, who is also grieving, is, if anything, even less equipped to acknowledge it. The rules for men were different, but in some ways equally constrictive. He could not weep. He could not be visibly broken. He had to be the steadying presence, even while he was crumbling inside. And so they grieved, together, in separate rooms. Connected, undeniably, but separated by the expectations that surrounded them, by the duty to appear whole when they were not. This is one of the most persistently painful things about Downton Abbey when you watch it slowly enough to let it settle. The people in it love each other, really love each other, fiercely, genuinely, but the world they inhabit has built walls between them that love alone cannot dismantle. And the women particularly lived inside those walls, surrounded by people, by servants and family and guests, and the constant social machinery of the house, and yet often profoundly, quietly alone. It is worth pausing here to consider how many of these marriages began. Not all of them were arranged in the formal, explicit sense, the sense of parents in a room agreeing on terms. But very few of them were purely the product of free, unconstrained choice. The season, That extended social ritual through which young women of appropriate background were presented to young men of appropriate background was a highly engineered system for producing marriages. It looked like a series of parties and balls and country weekends. But its underlying purpose was matchmaking. And the matches it produced were shaped by considerations that had very little to do with compatibility, money, title, land, social standing, family connections. A young woman in this system could express a preference. She could refuse someone she found genuinely objectionable. But her range of acceptable options was already narrowly defined by the world she moved in. And once the choice was made, once the engagement was announced, there was very little room for reconsidering. Lady Mary's romantic history in Downton Abbey is partly a portrait of this system. She navigates it with extraordinary skill, but she navigates it nonetheless. She does not escape it. She works within it, accepting certain constraints as non-negotiable while pushing against others. And in watching her navigate, in watching all of them navigate, we see women who are neither victims nor freely self-determining agents, but something more complicated than either. Women who made real choices within a world that had pre-made many of the important ones for them. And in the spaces between the scheduled obligations, the managed conversations, and the formal intimacy of their marriages, there was the loneliness that no one saw, and no one was supposed to see. A great house is never quiet in the way a small home is quiet. There are always footsteps somewhere, in the servants, corridor below, in the long gallery above, on the back stairs that lead from the kitchen to the upper floors. There is always the distant sound of movement, the clink of a tray, the soft thud of a door, the murmur of voices from another room. And yet, in the middle of all this presence, a woman could feel completely, comprehensively alone. Because the people who surrounded her were either servants, with whom certain kinds of intimacy were simply not appropriate, or family members or guests who were navigating their own social performances, or a husband who was often preoccupied, or physically absent, or present in body while being somewhere else entirely in mind. The kind of friendship, the kind of uncomplicated, honest, mutually vulnerable friendship that might have relieved that loneliness was very difficult to achieve in this world. Friendships between women of the same class required careful management. What you revealed and to whom was itself a calculation. Trust was rationed, because the consequences of misplaced trust, a confidence shared, a vulnerability used against you, could be significant. And the loneliness that resulted from this careful management of connection was not talked about. It was not named. It simply existed quietly as the background condition of many of their lives. Lady Cora's friendship with her ladies, maid, O'Brien in the early seasons, Baxter later, is revealing precisely because of its impossibility. These are women who spend enormous amounts of time together. The ladies, maid assist with dressing, with the daily routines of personal care, with the private logistics of her mistress's life. She knows things about Lady Cora that almost no one else knows. And yet, this is not a friendship. It cannot be. The social distance between them is too great, and bridging it would undermine the order that both of them depend on. So Lady Cora has a kind of intimacy with her maid, an intimacy of proximity and shared private space, without the genuine connection that might give it meaning. And among her social equals, she has connection without full intimacy. The conversations are real, the affection is real, but the full truth of who she is and what she feels remains, to most of them, largely hidden. Lady Mary and Lady Edith, sisters living under the same roof, are perhaps the most striking illustration of this. Their relationship through most of the series is one of the most compelling portraits of female loneliness I've encountered anywhere. They know each other intimately in the way that siblings always do, the bone-deep familiarity of a shared childhood, shared parents, shared history. And yet they use that knowledge against each other, again and again, in ways that suggest that genuine connection is too frightening to risk. The cruelty between them is, in part, a defense against the vulnerability that real closeness would require. And this is where things become more complicated than they first appear. Because the loneliness of these women was not just imposed from outside. Some of it, much of it, was the result of defenses they had built themselves. What did they think about in the spaces between their obligations? In the half hour before dinner when the house was quiet? In the long minutes of a winter afternoon when the light was fading and the fire had burned low? What did they want in a world where wanting the wrong things had consequences? This is something that Downton Abbey, at its best, manages to suggest without fully revealing. You can see it in the quality of attention that the best actresses bring to the quieter moments. The way a thought crosses a face and is then smoothed away. Lady Edith, in the middle seasons of the series, is carrying a secret that is, by the standards of her world, catastrophic. And watching her carry it, watching her maintain the daily performance of normality while living with something that could destroy her, is quietly unbearable. Because you understand that she has no one to tell. Not really. She cannot tell her parents. She cannot tell her sisters. She cannot tell her friends. She barely has friends, in the way we mean that word. She is carrying it alone, in a house full of people, behind a face that reveals nothing. This is what the internal life of these women often looked like. Not tranquility, not acceptance, but a constant, private wrestling with things they could not speak aloud. And perhaps the most surprising part of this story is that even in their own homes, even in the houses they were meant to preside over, there were places and roles they could never fully step into. At night, the great house had a different quality. The guests had retired. The servants had completed their last duties. The formal rooms, so alive during the day with conversation and movement, had gone still. And the women of the house were, at last, in their own rooms, their own time. This was the hour when some of them wrote letters, the long confessional letters to a mother or a trusted friend that have survived in archives, that historians have read with a kind of hushed attention because they reveal things that were never said in public. Things like, I am not sure I am happy. Things like, I wonder sometimes if this is all there is. Things like, I love him, and yet I am so very lonely. Those letters exist. They are real. And they are heartbreaking not because the women who wrote them were in despair, most were not, but because they reveal the size of the interior life that had nowhere else to go. A life that, in the morning, would be composed again, dressed again, managed again, a life that, at breakfast, would appear exactly as it was supposed to appear. And no one would know. They were never fully allowed to speak freely. We've touched on this, on the managed conversation, the restrained emotion, the careful navigation of what could be said and to whom, but I want to go deeper than the social rules. Because the speech that was most constrained was not public speech. It was private speech, the speech of the inner self. The thing that was most rigorously controlled was not what these women said at dinner. It was what they were allowed to say to themselves. The second great prohibition, unspoken but absolute, was the prohibition against self-directed ambition. A woman of this world could have extraordinary capabilities. She could be intelligent, perceptive, creatively gifted, organizationally brilliant. She could have ideas, real substantive ideas, about how the world worked and how it might work better. But the channels through which she could direct those capabilities were so narrow as to be almost invisible. She could manage a household, and this was real management, with real complexity, but it was not recognized as such. It was simply what she was supposed to do. She could influence those around her, and this influence was sometimes vast, sometimes decisive, but it operated through relationship and suggestion, not through authority or direct action. She could not enter a profession. She could not vote, at least not until the latter years that Downton's timeline begins to approach. She could not own property independently in most circumstances. She could not make legal decisions without her husband's involvement. Lady Edith's journey toward establishing a magazine, toward building something of her own, in the world, with her own name attached, is radical in her context. Genuinely radical. Not because what she does is so extraordinary by later standards, but because the very act of wanting to do it puts her outside the boundaries of what her world had defined as acceptable. And the resistance she encounters, the polite dismissal, the barely concealed condescension, the constant implication that this is not quite appropriate for a woman in her position, is as real and as persistent as anything she faces in her personal life. They could not reject the expectations that defined them. They could work within them, bend them slightly, find ways around the edges, but the expectations themselves were not up for negotiation. Perhaps the most absolute prohibition of all was the one against exit. If a marriage was unhappy, if it was actively damaging, there was almost no way for a woman to leave it. Divorce existed, but divorce in the world of early 20th century England was a social catastrophe. A divorced woman, particularly a woman who was seen to have instigated the divorce, or who was on the wrong side of it, was finished. Her social life was over. Her options for remarriage were extremely limited. Her relationship with her children could be complicated. Her reputation, and the reputation of her family, was irreparably damaged. The cost of leaving was so high that staying, even in very difficult circumstances, was often the rational choice. And so women stayed. They stayed in marriages that were cold and joyless. They stayed in marriages where they were unhappy, or overlooked, or simply living alongside someone they had never really known. And they made it work, not always through love, though love helped when it was there, but through routine, through duty, through the gradual construction of a life that had enough meaning in it, through children, through the house, through the quiet satisfactions of managing a complex world well, that the absence of certain other things could be borne. Lady Rosamond, Lord Grantham's sister, a widow, is one of the most interesting women in Downton precisely because she sits outside the marriage structure. Her husband's death has given her a kind of freedom that the married women around her do not have. And yet she uses it carefully, operating always within the bounds of what is acceptable for a woman of her standing. Because freedom in this world was relative, and for most of the women of Downton Abbey, it was very relative indeed. And the consequences for those who stepped too far outside the accepted boundaries, who broke the rules too visibly, too dramatically, were not abstract. They were real, and they were severe. I want to take a moment here before we move into the next section to say something that I think is important. It would be easy, telling this story, to frame it as a story of victims. Women trapped, women constrained, women denied. And all of that is true. The constraints were real. The denials were real. The cost of those constraints, in terms of human potential and human happiness, was significant. But these women were not simply victims of their world. They were also inhabitants of it, people who had absorbed its values deeply enough that many of its expectations did not feel like external impositions, but like internal convictions. Lady Violet genuinely believes that certain things are done and certain things are not done. She is not simply complying with expectations that feel foreign to her. She has internalized the values of her world so completely that its rules feel like her own. And this makes her both a product of her era and a kind of monument to it. She is formidable. She is admirable. And she has built herself, over decades, into someone who can navigate her world with extraordinary skill. The cost of that construction, what was left behind in the building of it, is not something she would be inclined to discuss. But it is there, in the occasional glimpse of something softer, something that might, in different circumstances, have been different. And in that glimpse is the full complexity of these women, who they were and who they might have been, and the world that made the distance between those two things so very large. In the world of Downton Abbey, the upstairs and the downstairs are separated by more than a physical staircase. They are separated by an entire cosmology, a way of understanding the world, a set of assumptions about order and hierarchy and appropriate behavior that both sides have internalized so deeply that it rarely needs to be explicitly stated. And yet, and this is one of the things that makes Downton Abbey as a drama so compelling, the two worlds are deeply entangled. The servants know things about the family that the family does not always know about itself. They witness moments that are not meant to be witnessed. They carry knowledge of the real state of the marriage, of the actual finances, of the genuine emotions behind the composed surfaces that gives them a particular kind of power. Not a power they can use directly, but a power nonetheless. And the women of the house, the mistress in particular, live with the constant low-level awareness that they are observed. The people who were closest to them physically knew the most about them. And that knowledge, accumulated quietly over years of service, was one of the most intimate and most uncomfortable facts of their lives. The relationship between the mistress of the house and her servants was genuinely paradoxical. She had authority over them, in theory, absolute authority. She could dismiss a servant. She could set their working conditions. She could determine the tone and culture of the household below stairs in ways that had significant effects on people's lives. But she was also entirely dependent on them, dependent on the cook for the quality of meals that her social position required, dependent on the housekeeper for the smooth running of a household too complex for any one person to manage, dependent on her ladies made for the very clothes on her back, because the clothes of that era, with their complex fastenings and structured layers, often could not be put on or taken off without assistance. This is an extraordinary intimacy. Her maid knows her body, knows her habits, knows the days when she is unwell, the evenings when she has been crying, the mornings when something is wrong that she has not yet named. And the relationship between mistress and maid, this strange combination of authority and dependence, of intimacy and distance, is one of the most quietly fascinating things in all of Downton Abbey. Carson and Hughes, Bates and Anna, O'Brien and Cora. Each of these relationships is its own world, its own set of loyalties and tensions and mutual understanding. And in each of them we see something about the women upstairs that the women themselves might not have been able to articulate. The servants saw the women behind the performance, and sometimes, in the small, unguarded moments, the women knew they were being seen. One of the most poignant recurring elements in Downton Abbey is the moments where the divide between upstairs and downstairs almost, but not quite, dissolves. A moment of genuine warmth between a mistress and a servant. A moment of shared grief. A moment where something real passes between them, crossing the social distance that is supposed to make such exchange impossible. These moments are carefully managed on both sides. They cannot last. There is always a return to the appropriate distance. But they suggest something important about the emotional landscape of the great house. That the loneliness of the women upstairs was in some ways mirrored, though in very different circumstances, by the loneliness of the women downstairs. Different constraints, different freedoms, different kinds of powerlessness. But the same fundamental human need, to be seen, to be known, to have someone in one's life who understood, without explanation, the full weight of what one was carrying. Most of them, upstairs and downstairs both, lived without that. They lived with good enough substitutes, with partial connection, with the warmth that could exist within the appropriate social distance. And they made do. As the evening settled over a house like Downton Abbey, the quality of time changed. The formal day, with its obligations and its audiences and its performances, wound down. Dinner was over. The drawing room had emptied. The servants were completing their last rounds of the evening. And the women of the house were moving through the long corridors toward their own rooms. These corridors, late at night, had a different quality than they did during the day. The gas lamps, or, in later years, the newly installed electric lights, cast pools of illumination that left the spaces between them in shadow. And in that transition, between the social world of the evening and the private world of the night, there was a brief window. A window where the performance could relax slightly, where the face could settle into something less managed. where the thoughts that had been held carefully at bay all day could begin, cautiously, to surface. It was in these quiet hours after the world had stopped watching that the women of Downton were, perhaps, most fully themselves. What did those hours contain? For some, particularly in the years before Downton's timeline begins, they contained prayer. The ritualized prayer of the Church of England, which provided both comfort and structure. For others, correspondence. The long letters we spoke of earlier, written by lamplight to mothers and sisters and trusted friends, saying the things that could not be said in daylight. For some, reading. The novel that was hidden from public view not because it was scandalous, though some were, but because the kind of absorbed private attention it required was something that felt dangerous to admit needing. And for some, something simpler. Just stillness. Just the experience of being alone in one's own room, without the weight of what was expected. Lady Mary, in the aftermath of Matthew's death, spends months in a kind of interior grief that the world around her is not able to fully access. She goes through the motions, she is present at meals, she attends to her son, she manages the practical necessities, but she has retreated somewhere that polite society cannot reach. And it is only at night, in the quiet of her room, away from the observation of the household, that this retreat becomes fully visible. And it is in this private world, this hidden emotional interior, that we find what might be the most important truth about these women. That the inner life they maintained, in spite of everything, was vast and real and theirs. There is a conversation about crying that is worth having. In the world of Downton Abbey, in the real world of early 20th century English aristocracy, crying was permitted under very specific circumstances. The death of a close family member, perhaps in extreme circumstances, the reception of catastrophically bad news. These were contexts in which tears were understandable, if still preferably private. But crying from loneliness? From frustration? From the accumulated weight of years of performing a self that was not quite your full self? Not appropriate, not something to be seen. And so it happened behind closed doors, in the private rooms, in the quiet hours. And in the morning, the face was composed again. The hair was arranged, the appropriate dress was put on, and the performance resumed. This is not tragedy in the dramatic sense. No one died from it. No one was destroyed by it, not usually. But it is a kind of chronic, low-grade loss. The loss of the freedom to be fully, honestly oneself in the presence of others. The loss of the kind of connection that requires that freedom. And over a lifetime, over decades of managed presentation, that loss accumulated. Reputation in the world of Downton Abbey was not merely a social nicety, it was a survival mechanism. In a world where women had very limited direct access to power, money, or legal protection, reputation served as a kind of currency. A woman with an excellent reputation had options. A woman with a damaged reputation had far fewer, and sometimes none at all. This made the social world that these women moved in extraordinarily high stakes, in ways that were not always visible from the outside. A careless remark, a misunderstood interaction, a rumor started by whom, for what reason, often impossible to trace, could begin a process of social erosion that was very difficult to reverse. Lady Edith's secret, her illegitimate daughter, born from an affair with a married man, would, if it had fully entered public knowledge, have been precisely this kind of catastrophe. It would have closed doors, changed the quality of her social life, affected her family, and the length to which she goes to protect it, the layers of deception, the arrangements and compromises, the years of living with a secret that she cannot share, reflect not paranoia, but an accurate assessment of the consequences. One mistake could follow them forever, and in a world without social media, without the rapid cycle of news that we know today, gossip moved slowly, but it lasted. It lasted for years, for generations. There is a particular quality to the social judgment of this world that is worth examining. It was rarely explicit, rarely confrontational. It expressed itself instead in small, subtle exclusions. A dinner invitation not extended, a conversation that stopped when you entered the room, the slightly too long pause before a response, the visiting card that did not arrive. These were the instruments of social punishment, and they were wielded with considerable precision by a community of people who understood the system very well. The Dowager Countess is the supreme practitioner of this art. She can destroy someone socially without raising her voice, in fact, without losing her composure at all. A single well-placed observation, delivered with just the right degree of indifference, can close a door that the target might not even realize has been closed. And the women who were subject to this judgment, or who feared being subject to it, shaped their behavior accordingly. Not because they were cowards, but because the cost of defiance was real, and the benefits of conformity, the smoothness of daily life, the continued access to the social world that provided both connection and status, were also real. It was a rational calculation, and most of them made it. But what happened when they did step out of line? When the rules were broken, either by choice or by accident, or by circumstances beyond their control, the consequences were not always what you might expect. Fear, quiet, constant, unnamed, was a presence in these women's lives. Not the dramatic fear of immediate danger, but the lower frequency fear of getting something wrong, of misjudging a situation, of failing to read the social temperature correctly, and making a move that damaged something fragile. This fear shaped choices in ways that were often barely conscious. The conversation that was steered away from a sensitive topic, the opinion that was softened before it was expressed, the desire that was considered and then set aside as impractical. All of these were, in part, responses to that underlying fear. And the women who seemed the most composed, the ones who appeared most effortlessly to belong in their world, were often the ones who were managing that fear with the greatest skill, not the ones who had ceased to feel it. Lady Violet's composure is legendary, but it is not the composure of someone who has nothing to fear. It is the composure of someone who has learned to manage fear so completely that it no longer shows on the surface. That is a skill, and like all skills, it was learned. Through experience, through error, through the slow accumulation of a lifetime of navigating a world that required it. Of all the expectations placed on women in the aristocratic world of early 20th century England, perhaps none was more fundamental and more intimate than the expectation of producing an heir. This was not a preference. It was not a hope. It was a requirement. The continuity of a great house, its land, its title, its entire reason for existing, depended on the male line, and the male line depended on the wife. This placed the female body at the center of a vast institutional concern. Whether a woman had children, how many, the sex of those children, the health and fitness of those children, for the roles they would one day fill. All of this was public business, dressed in the clothes of private life. Lady Cora's miscarriage, the loss of what would have been the male heir, is experienced in Downton Abbey not only as a personal tragedy, but as an institutional crisis. The estate faces a question about its future. The family faces a question about its continuity. And Cora, grieving the loss of a child, is also navigating the failure to meet an expectation that was never explicitly stated, but was always understood. The pressure of that expectation, unspoken, constant, impossible to escape, was one of the most intimate forms of constraint that these women experienced. When children did arrive, the relationship that was expected between mother and child in the aristocratic world of Downton Abbey was not the warm, hands-on relationship that we might think of as natural today. Infants were handed to nurses. Young children lived in the nursery under the supervision of a nanny, with parents appearing at arranged intervals for tea, for a goodnight kiss, for the carefully choreographed moments that constituted parental involvement in that world. This is not to say that mothers did not love their children. Of course they did. But the love was expressed at a distance and through intermediaries in a way that could create a strange emotional formality even between parent and child. Lady Cora's relationship with her daughters is warm, genuinely warm, but you can also see the shape of the system in it. The moments of connection happen in certain contexts and not others. There is an appropriate way to express love and an appropriate time. And the result is a kind of love that is real and present, but also, sometimes, oddly formal. Mary, Edith, and Sybil, for all the privilege of their upbringing, grew up in a household where certain kinds of emotional directness simply were not modeled. And the ways in which they struggle, as adults, to express what they feel and need, from parents, from siblings, from partners, carries the mark of that upbringing. And the parenting that was delegated, the emotional labor handed to nurses and nannies and governesses, was labor that some mothers genuinely mourned the loss of, even as the system required it. There is something quietly painful about watching Lady Cora interact with her grandchildren, the grandchildren who appear in the later seasons, compared to how she interacted with her own daughters when they were small. Something has shifted, slightly. The formality is less rigid. The warmth finds a slightly freer expression, as though the passage of time and the cultural changes that time has brought has loosened something that was once held very tight. But for most of the women of Downton's world, in the prime years of their lives, that loosening had not yet happened. They loved their children, and they managed that love within a framework that kept it at arm's length for much of the time. And some of them, the ones who felt most keenly the distance that the framework imposed, found ways to be present in smaller, more personal ways. A particular attentiveness during the approved visiting hours, a care about the details of a child's education that went beyond what was strictly required. These small acts of maternal presence were the only channel available, and they used them. But the full, immersive experience of motherhood, the kind of daily, hands-on connection that would feel normal today, was simply not part of their world. And whether they grieved that, or accepted it, or simply never thought to want what they had not been given to want, we cannot always know. I promised you earlier that this would not be only a story of suffering. And it isn't. Because alongside all the constraint, the rules, the silences, the managed emotions, the delegated parenting, the social pressures, there was something else. There was power, quiet power, indirect power, power that operated through channels that the formal world did not recognize as power, but that were, in practice, highly effective. The Dowager Countess is the clearest example, but she is not the only one. Lady Cora shapes the major decisions of Downton Abbey in ways that are easy to miss because they are never presented as decisions at all. A conversation in a private moment, a perspective offered at the right time, a concern expressed in a way that makes it impossible to dismiss, a relationship managed so that when a crisis comes, the right people are inclined to be helpful. This is power. Different from the power that Robert exercises openly, different in kind, different in method, but not necessarily smaller in effect. And here is the unexpected twist in this story. Some of the most significant things that happened at Downton Abbey were shaped not by the men who held the formal authority, but by the women who operated behind the scenes of that authority. The management of relationships between family members, between the family and the servants, between the household and the outside world, was almost entirely in the hands of the women. And this was not nothing. In a world where everything ran on personal connection, where who you knew and how well they thought of you, and whether they would pick up a telephone and make a call on your behalf, the woman who managed those relationships was managing something vital. Lady Violet understands this completely. Her network, built over decades, maintained through the assiduous work of social connection, is one of the most significant resources that Downton Abbey as an institution possesses. When a favor needs to be called in, when a door needs to be opened, when something needs to happen through channels that formal authority cannot reach, Violet is the person who knows how to make it happen. This is expertise. It is real expertise, developed over a lifetime. But it is expertise that the world she lives in does not formally recognize, credit, or compensate. It is simply assumed to be what women do. And in that assumption, in that quiet erasure of the labor involved, we see perhaps the most complete illustration of what their world cost them, not just in what they couldn't do, but in what they did do and were never fully seen for. There are decisions made at Downton Abbey, significant ones, decisions that shape the fate of the estate and the family, that are made in conversations between women, between Cora and Violet, between Mary and Violet, between Cora and Mary. These conversations are presented in drawing rooms, over tea, in the private sitting rooms where the men of the house are not present. They are framed as personal conversations, as the natural exchange of women who care about the same things. But they are strategy sessions. They are the places where the real analysis happens, where the options are weighed, where the consensus is built that will eventually be presented to Robert, framed as his own conclusion, or as a polite suggestion, or as simply the obvious right thing to do. The skill required to do this, to shape a decision while appearing not to be shaping it, to exercise influence while maintaining the form of deference, is genuinely remarkable. And it is a skill that these women developed because the direct exercise of authority was not available to them. They took the available channels and used them with extraordinary intelligence. That is not passivity. That is adaptation. And it deserves to be recognized for exactly what it was. And yet, for all the adaptation, all the skill, all the quiet navigation of an impossible system, sometimes the rules broke. Or were broken. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, sometimes because circumstances conspired to make breaking them unavoidable. And when they broke, the consequences came. Not always dramatically, not always immediately, but they came. Lady Edith's pregnancy, the pregnancy that she carries in secret, that she gives birth to outside the knowledge of her family, that she places with a tenant farmer's family in an attempt to keep near to her while hiding what happened, is perhaps the most dramatic example of the consequences of stepping outside the rules. What she has done is, by the standards of her world, catastrophic. She was not married. The man involved is complicated. The child exists. And the child's existence, if known, would be precisely the kind of revelation that could define her publicly for the rest of her life. And so she manages it, imperfectly, painfully, at enormous emotional cost. The silent punishment for breaking the rules was not always external judgment. Sometimes, often, it was internal. The weight of carrying a secret, the cost of maintaining a deception, the slow erosion of the self that comes from living too far outside the truth. For the women whose rule-breaking became public or semi-public, the social consequences were immediate and concrete. They stopped being invited to certain things. They found that certain conversations stopped when they entered rooms. The quality of the welcome they received in social situations changed, subtly, undeniably. And because this world was small, the circle of people whose opinion mattered was genuinely small, and everyone knew everyone else. The change was everywhere. There was no escape from it through geography. A woman who had transgressed in Yorkshire would find that London knew about it. A woman who had transgressed in London would find that the country house world knew within weeks. The only option, the only real option, was either to regain the lost ground through subsequent exemplary behavior, or to find a way to exist outside the system that had judged you. The latter was very difficult. The world outside the social system of the upper classes was genuinely foreign territory for a woman who had grown up inside it. She had no skills for it, no relationships that extended into it, no practical knowledge of how to navigate it. And so most of them chose the former. They worked, quietly and persistently, to restore themselves, to demonstrate that the transgression was an aberration, that the performance of appropriate femininity could be resumed. And in the resumption of that performance, in the return to the role after the moment of breaking, there was something both admirable and heartbreaking. But perhaps the most interesting punishments were the ones that never became fully explicit. The punishments that lived in the altered quality of a relationship, in the permanent slight shift in how someone was treated by a person who knew something, or suspected something, or simply disapproved. Lady Mary, throughout much of the early series, carries the consequences of an event from her past that cannot be spoken of directly, an evening that ended in a death, and a secret that was buried with enormous difficulty and at enormous cost. The knowledge of that event, held by a small number of people, never discussed openly, nonetheless shapes the way certain characters relate to her, the power it gives some people over her, the caution with which she navigates certain relationships. She lives with it, she carries it, and the carrying of it changes her, makes her more guarded, more careful, more aware of the cost of moments of unguarded humanity. That is a silent punishment, a punishment that exists not in any formal censure, but in the ongoing alteration of a life. We have spoken of the external constraints, the rules of speech, the structured time, the social pressures, the managed emotions. But there is an interior dimension to this story that is harder to access. What did these women think? Not what they said, not what they wrote even in the carefully managed letters, but what they actually thought in the privacy of their own minds when no performance was required. This is, of course, ultimately inaccessible. We cannot know. But we can speculate on the basis of what they left behind, the letters, the diaries, the accounts of women who lived in this world and occasionally broke the habit of self-censorship enough to say what they actually meant. And what emerges from those fragments is a picture of considerable complexity. There was frustration, quiet, persistent, and often turned inward rather than expressed outward. The frustration of capability that had nowhere adequate to go, of intelligence that was not fully engaged, of ambition that had no legitimate outlet. There was, sometimes, genuine contentment, the pleasures of a well-run household, the satisfactions of social mastery, the warmth of genuine connection within the narrow channels that permitted it. But beneath both the frustration and the contentment, there was often a question that could not be asked aloud, a question that most of them had learned not to form too clearly, because forming it clearly would have made the answer too painful. The question was, who am I beneath the role? It is a question that most people who live inside a very demanding role eventually encounter. The performance becomes so practiced, so constant, so much a part of the daily texture of existence, that the performer inside begins to lose track of where the performance ends and where she begins. For the women of Downton Abbey, women who had been shaped by the role since childhood, who had not had the experience of living outside it before entering it, this question was particularly acute. Lady Sybil's journey toward nursing, toward a concrete, practical, socially useful role that was entirely outside the framework of who she was supposed to be, is partly a journey toward answering this question. She discovers, in the chaos and necessity of wartime nursing, that there is a self underneath the performance, a self that is capable and present and valuable in ways that have nothing to do with her birth or her social standing. It is one of the most moving arcs in the series, and it is cut tragically short, which is, in its own way, true to the period. The women who moved toward fuller selfhood often encountered obstacles that the show does not soften. And yet, even without Sybil's dramatic journey, something similar, quieter, and less visible was happening inside many of the women of Downton. A slow, private process of working out who they were, in the spaces that the role had not fully occupied. How did they survive it? Not just endure, many of them did considerably more than merely endure. They built lives that had genuine meaning and genuine moments of happiness. They found satisfactions that were real, even if they were not the satisfactions they might have chosen if the choice had been fully theirs. The mechanisms of that survival are worth naming. Humor was one of them. The Dowager Countess's wit is not simply a character trait, it is a survival strategy. The ability to see the absurdity in one's own situation, to hold it at a slight ironic distance, provides a kind of protection against being fully crushed by it. Friendship, where it could be achieved, was another. Imperfect, partial, carefully managed, but real. The warmth between Cora and Violet, complicated, sometimes adversarial, but fundamentally characterized by mutual respect and, I think, genuine affection, is one of the more sustaining relationships in the series. And purpose, the experience of being genuinely useful, of making things happen, of mattering, was perhaps the most important. Even within the narrow channels available to them, these women found ways to matter, to make real differences in real lives, to exercise judgment and skill and care in ways that had actual consequences. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. And holding both truths at once, the constraint and the achievement, the limitation and the genuine capability, is perhaps the most honest way to see them. As the evening settles over Downton Abbey, as the last guests have made their way to their rooms and the servants are completing their final duties, as the house grows quiet in the particular way that only a very large house can grow quiet, I want to return to the beginning, to the image we started with, the view from outside the gate. The first impression of a world of beauty and order and impossible elegance. That impression was not false. The beauty was real. The elegance was real. The extraordinary, intricate, carefully maintained world of the great English country house, with its traditions and its rituals and its particular way of organizing human life, was real. But so was everything else we've explored tonight. The silence that lived inside the conversation, the loneliness that lived inside the company, the constraint that lived inside the grace, and the women who held all of it together, who were, in a very real sense, the living architecture of that world, were more than the roles they played. Infinitely more. And the history we carry about them, the image of the elegant, aristocratic wife, composed and unhurried and perfectly positioned, is only part of the truth. The other part is the woman behind the image, and she deserves to be seen. History has a way of recording the visible. The decisions that were made openly, the actions that were taken in public, the words that were spoken in places where they could be heard and recorded. And in that history, the history of the early 20th century, of England's aristocracy, of the great houses and their complicated relationship with a changing world, the women of Downton's world are often present but not quite seen. They are there in the background of photographs, in the guest lists of dinner parties, in the records of charity work and social obligations that constitute the paper trail of their lives. But the interior of those lives, the thoughts and the frustrations and the hidden joys and the late night letters and the managed grief and the quiet power and the enormous capability directed into channels too narrow to fully contain it, that is not in the records. It is in the traces, in the fragments, in the careful reading of absence, what is not said, in letters and diaries, and why it might have been left out. In the drama of Downton Abbey, which, for all its entertainment value, takes these women seriously in ways that official history sometimes does not, we have a kind of extended meditation on those traces. A 2-hour, season after season attempt to imagine the interior of lives that were carefully, habitually hidden. And what that imagining reveals, even in its fictional form, is something genuinely important. That the women of that world were formidable, complex, capable, constrained, lonely, connected, frustrated, satisfied. That they were, in other words, fully human in a world that required them to appear something rather less than that. Lady Mary, in the final season of Downton Abbey, makes a decision. A decision about her own life, her own future. A decision made quietly, clearly, with a particular composure that has always characterized her, on the basis of what she actually wants. Not what the role requires, not what the household expects, not what the social world around her would consider appropriate. What she wants. And watching her make that decision, watching the decades of conditioning give way, just slightly, to something more personal, is quietly extraordinary. Because you understand what it has cost her to arrive there. What years of performing and managing and containing herself have built in her, alongside everything else. Not just the composure, but the knowledge, finally, of herself beneath it. That is what the long journey through constraint has produced. Not simply a woman who has endured, but a woman who knows herself, really knows herself, in a way that might not have been possible without the specific pressure of the world she survived. That is not a defense of the world she lived in, but it is an honest acknowledgement of what it produced. People of extraordinary complexity, tempered by an extraordinary degree of pressure. People who knew how to be exactly what the world required, and who managed, in the spaces between, to remain more than that. And now, as this long evening draws to its close, as the fire in the drawing room has burned low, and the last lamp has been turned down in the hallway, and the house has gone still in that particular way that belongs only to the very late hours. I want to leave you with something, an image. Somewhere in a great English house in the early decades of the 20th century, a woman is sitting by a window in the last light of a winter afternoon. The house is quiet around her. Her duties are done for the day, or at least paused until tomorrow. And for a moment, just a moment, She is not the countess or the wife or the mother or the mistress of the house. She is simply a woman, sitting by a window, watching the light change over the gardens. Thinking something that she will not say at dinner, feeling something that she will not show in company. Being, for this brief, unobserved moment, exactly and entirely herself. And then the bell rings, or a door opens, or footsteps approach in the corridor. And she gathers herself, gently, practiced, without drama, and becomes, again, everything that is expected. And the moment is over. But it happened. It was real. And in all the history that was carefully not recorded, in all the interior lives that were carefully not shown, those moments were what was most true. If you have stayed with me through this long and quiet exploration of the hidden lives of Downton Abbey's women, then I suspect you already understand why stories like this matter. Not because they tell us something we didn't know, but because they remind us to look more carefully at the worlds we think we understand. To notice the things that are not said, the feelings that are managed rather than expressed, the capabilities that are exercised through indirect channels because the direct ones are closed. To notice the women standing at the edges of the frame, holding the whole thing together, and to ask, quietly, what their full lives looked like from the inside. Thank you for being here. I hope the night holds you gently. If you are still awake, hit the subscribe and share with a friend. See you next time.